Melania Trump came back after more than a month out of public view. She walked out with Donald Trump, held his hand, looked at the crowd, and opened with 5 words that showed she knew exactly what people had been talking about. I heard you missed me. Now that sounds like a joke, and maybe it was, but the timing made it much more interesting. Because while Melania was out of public view, another woman around Donald Trump has suddenly become one of the biggest stories in Washington, Natalie Harp. And at the same time, the White House was trying to decide who would replace Karoline Leavitt as press secretary. So suddenly, three separate stories started touching each other: Melania, Natalie, and a major White House job. That is where this gets interesting. First, let's deal with Melania's return, because it would be easy to make this more dramatic than the facts allow. There is no proof that Melania came back because people were talking about Natalie Harp. We should not pretend that there is. Her event was real and it was connected to the real program for young people leaving foster care. But here is what still matters. This was Melania's first public appearance in about a month. So when she walks back into public view and says, "I heard you missed me," that is not the line of someone who has no idea what the press has been saying. She knows her absence became a story. She knows people noticed. And instead of ignoring it, she made it the first thing she talked about. Then came another image that got a lot of attention: Melania and Trump holding hands. Now we have to be careful here. A picture cannot tell us what happens inside a marriage. A few seconds of holding hands cannot prove everything is perfect, and it cannot prove that something is wrong either. But politics is also about pictures and signals. And when a first lady is out of public view for weeks, while another airs closeness to the president is becoming a national story, a very public show of unity is naturally going to get people talking. That does not prove a connection, but it does explain why the timing caught so much attention. But then come the first real twist. The Natalie Harp story is moving in a different directions than some headlines make it sound. Yes, there has been reporting that Trump's joked to advisors that maybe Natalie Harp could replace Karoline Leavitt as press secretary. But the key word is joked. There is no report that Harp has been chosen. There is no report that has been formally offered the job. In fact, other names are also being discussed, including Scott Jennings. So the real question is not, is Natalie about to become press secretary? We simply don't know that. The more interesting question is, how did Natalie Harp become this important so quickly? Think about it. Not long ago, most Americans had no idea who she was. Then Jon Ossoff used her name in one line of speech. He talked about Trump traveling with Natalie. 2 words, and suddenly Washington exploded. Trump's allies immediately defended her. Reporters started asking, who is Natalie Harp? Then came stories about how close she works to Trump, how she gives him printed news, and how she helps him with social media, and how often she is physically near him. Suddenly, a background staff member became part of the national political conversation. And here is the strange part. The people trying hardest to defend Natalie may have helped make her more famous. That is how modern politics works. Attention itself can become a kind of power. If the White House had simply said she is an executive assistant, the comment was silly, let's move on, maybe the story would have disappeared. Instead, every angry reaction gave reporters another reason to ask another question. And while all of this was happening, Karoline Leavitt was preparing to leave her White House role. That created a real opening inside Trump's team. And now Trump has a real decision. Does he choose someone who is already personally close to him? Does he choose a television fighter like Scott Jennings, or does he choose someone who can manage the entire White House press operations every single day? Those are very different skills. And this is where the Natalie Harp story becomes much more important than simple gossip. Harp's real value to Trump appears to come from access and trust. She is often near him, she gives him information, she helps manage material that reaches him, that gives her a quiet kind of influence. A press secretary has a very different kind of power. That person has to stand in front of cameras, answer reporters, and speak for the entire White House. So moving Harp from one role to another would not simply to be a promotion. It would completely change the kind of influence she has. And maybe that is why Trump's joke is interesting, even if it never becomes real. Because it tells us something about what Trump values. Trump has always placed a very high values on loyalty, and Natalie Harp is constantly described as loyal and hardworking. So step back and look at the whole picture. Melania returns after weeks away from public view. Natalie Harp goes from a little-known aide to a national political story. Karoline Leavitt is leaving. Scott Jennings is being discussed. Trump jokes about Natalie getting the job, and everybody is fighting over what two words from Jon Ossoff were supposed to mean. That is a lot of movement from one teeny comment, and maybe that is the most important part of this whole story. Washington is supposed to be about laws, policy, budgets, wars, and elections, but sometimes power turns on something much smaller. Who has access, who gets defended, who gets noticed, who gets invited into the room, and who can turn one small line into a full week of national headlines. Those questions can tell you a lot about how power really works inside Washington.